Everyone in the neighborhood knew her name, whispered it like a warning. HOA Karen. She had a way of walking down the street that made you feel like your every move was being recorded in some invisible ledger, ready to be judged, rated, and reported. And I had just learned the hard way that crossing her wasn't just a mistake. It was a declaration of war. It started on a Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the sunlight cuts through the clouds and paints the lawns gold. I stepped outside, proud as ever, to hang the flag my father had given me, the one my grandfather had flown in his small hometown parade decades ago. A symbol, yes, but for me, it was memory and pride stitched into fabric. I didn't notice her at first. Karen, peering over the hedge of her perfectly trimmed yard, arms crossed, sunglasses glinting in the sun. The moment she saw the flag, her face tightened. That faint smile, more a sneer than anything else. I froze, that familiar pit forming in my stomach. I'd seen her before, her emails, the letters, the petty complaints that made life unbearable if you dared to paint your door the wrong shade or trim your tree incorrectly. But this was different. By the time I turned back toward my house to get coffee, I heard it, the sharp, ripping sound. My flag, the symbol of my family's pride, was being yanked down, and in its place, a note crisp and accusatory stapled to the pole. Violation of HOA regulations. Remove immediately or face penalties. I stared. I could feel the heat rise in my chest, not anger, not yet, but the betrayal of knowing someone could take so much satisfaction in small cruelty. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper, reading the words over and over as if the act itself could make sense of the injustice. But it didn't. It only confirmed what I'd already feared. Karen had targeted me, not my lawn, not my mailbox, me. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Jensen, an older woman who had lived on this street longer than anyone. Her eyes widened when I told her. "Oh, honey, that's classic Karen," she said. "She likes to pick one person a week and make them miserable. Sometimes she goes too far." Her pause was telling. Too far. I didn't know what that meant, but the weight of her words sank into me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every shadow in the yard seemed to grow taller. Every whisper of wind felt like surveillance. I imagined Karen peeking from her windows, cataloging my fear. And in that moment I realized something else, something terrifying. I wasn't just angry. I felt small, judged, forgotten by anyone who mattered, like a piece of street furniture she could move at will. But then a spark lit inside me. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was memory. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind, a deep, warm rumble. Stand for what matters, even if it's just a flag. Pride, honor, dignity. It didn't always come from being loud. Sometimes it came from simply refusing to be erased. The next morning, I walked outside with the remnants of my flag clutched in my hands. Karen was already there, clipboard in hand, frowning like I was some kind of criminal. But this time, I didn't feel small. Not yet. I felt something else, a quiet determination, a decision that if she wanted a fight, I would give her more than she expected. What I didn't know then was that this was no ordinary neighbor dispute. This was the kind of situation that changes everything, the kind of story that spreads, not through gossip, but through action. And while I stared at that torn flag, I had no idea just how many people were about to rise alongside me. Because Karen thought this was about a flag. She didn't know it was about community, pride, and the long, slow awakening of a town that refused to be bullied. And when the first whispers started to circulate, the ripple was unstoppable. She thought she had won. HOA Karen, with her perfectly pressed blouse and sharp, calculating eyes, believed that one torn flag, one stapled note, was enough to make me bend, to make me disappear quietly into compliance. But she had underestimated something far greater than rules and regulations. She had underestimated the stubbornness of people who refused to be silenced. Word spread faster than I expected. By Monday morning, whispers traveled from yard to yard, through the subtle nods of nodding neighbors and the quick exchanges over fences. "Did you hear about what she did to his flag?" someone would ask. And like wildfire, murmurs grew into conversations, conversations into solidarity. People began to remember their own battles, moments when they had felt the weight of arbitrary authority pressing down, and how often it went unchecked. I didn't know it yet, but Karen's arrogance was about to become her undoing. Every time she strutted down the street, checking off imaginary boxes in her mind, she passed houses that had quietly started to rally behind me. My mailbox wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a symbol, a banner for anyone who had felt small under her scrutiny. But this was no overnight revolution. Change starts quietly, almost imperceptibly. I noticed the glances first. The elderly man across the street who always kept to himself would linger a little longer by his garden, nodding in silent approval. The young mother who spent hours chasing her kids and barely had time to breathe would stop to wave, her eyes saying, "I see you, we see you." It was subtle, yet electric. The undercurrent of community had shifted. Karen, of course, noticed nothing, or she pretended not to. She thrived on the illusion of control. Every letter she sent, every email she fired off to the HOA board was meant to tighten her grip. But each action backfired. People started quietly defying her. Flags went up in secret in backyards, hidden just enough to be safe. Garden gnomes with tiny banners appeared. A neighbor posted a handmade sign, simple words in bold paint. "We won't be bullied." One afternoon, I watched from my porch as Karen confronted Mr. Patel, who had hung a small flag by his front door. She wagged her finger, her voice sharp and unforgiving, demanding compliance. But Mr. Patel didn't flinch. He squared his shoulders, stared back at her with a calmness that spoke louder than any words. "I'm not hurting anyone," he said. "I'm just living." Karen's face twisted with frustration, the kind of rage that only comes when control slips through your fingers. It was intoxicating, witnessing the cracks in her armor. And yet, beneath the satisfaction, there was tension. I could feel it in my chest, the kind that comes when a storm is brewing. I knew this wouldn't end quietly. Karen was relentless, and she wasn't going to give up easily, but neither were we. That night, I gathered a few neighbors I trusted, people who had quietly taken stands in their own ways. We met in my backyard, the air thick with anticipation. The sky was painted in shades of deep purple and gold, and the faint hum of crickets seemed to echo our collective heartbeat. We shared stories of small injustices, of moments when we felt invisible, dismissed, or punished unfairly. Each story added fuel to a fire that had already started burning inside us. It was then I realized something profound. This wasn't about a flag. It was never about a flag. It was about dignity. About the quiet insistence that we had a right to exist, to display our pride, to live without fear of petty domination. And in that backyard, under the fatting sun, we made a pact, not a loud one, not written, not formal, but a promise that we would stand together. Over the next few days, the town began to shift. People who had previously been hesitant stepped forward. The local bakery put up a sign supporting community expression. The hardware store offered discounts on flagpoles and banners. Even the school principal, who had always kept her head down during HOA conflicts, quietly encouraged students to create artwork celebrating local heritage. It was subtle but unstoppable. The tide was turning. And Karen, she was furious. Every attempt to assert authority was met with quiet defiance. Every threat a calm refusal. She didn't see it coming. She couldn't. The very thing she had tried to suppress, community spirit, pride, solidarity, had grown roots deeper than her rules. But the real question loomed larger than any HOA letter or petty spat. When would Karen push too far? And when that moment came, would the town rise all at once, or would she find a way to strike first? I didn't know the answer yet. All I knew was that the battle lines were drawn, and the next move would determine everything. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching lights flicker on in the neighboring houses, I felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. Fear, because Karen's next move could be devastating. Hope, because for the first time I wasn't alone. And in that moment I realized that the smallest acts of courage, raising a flag, standing your ground, can ignite something far larger than one person alone. This was just the beginning. The air was thick the morning Karen decided to escalate. I saw her car rolling down the street like an omen, polished and perfect, windows reflecting the sun as if the glare could blind anyone who dared oppose her. Her eyes were sharper than knives that day, scanning every mailbox, every yard, every person who dared to glance her way. She had made a mistake, though. She had mistaken the quiet nods of solidarity for weakness. It started with another letter, official, stamped, impossible to ignore. But this time the wording carried a different weight. It wasn't just a demand to remove flags or correct violations. It was a threat. Fines, penalties, potential legal action. And the signature at the bottom was unmistakable, HOA Karen. She wanted control. She wanted fear. She wanted to prove dominance. I held the letter in my hands, feeling the edges crumple slightly under my grip. My heart pounded, not just with anger, but with something deeper, the knowledge that this was turning personal. And in this neighborhood, personal didn't stay quiet. It didn't stay small. By noon, I could see the effect. My neighbors, who had been quietly defiant, were gathering. Behind closed doors, on front porches, in whispered conversations over coffee, a plan was forming. Not one of rebellion for rebellion's sake. Not chaos, but a statement. A statement that we would not be bullied, that the spirit of a community could not be stamped out by petty rules or a single person's ego. Karen, of course, remained oblivious, or pretended to be. She walked down the street, clipboard in hand, issuing her proclamations, each one met with polite nods, forced smiles, and subtle glances that said, "We are stronger than you think." But beneath her polished exterior, I could see the tension start to crack her composure. It was in the slight twitch of her hand, the way her jaw tightened when someone ignored her, the way her eyes flickered toward groups of neighbors standing together. That evening, I gathered a few of the braver souls in my backyard again. We talked in whispers, but our voices carried conviction. We shared fears and doubts, moments when we had almost given in to the pressure, almost erased ourselves to avoid confrontation. Each confession drew us closer, tied us together with invisible threads stronger than any rule she could impose. And then the first plan took shape. Not aggressive, not violent, smart, visible, unignorable, a coordinated display of flags, banners, and messages of community pride. Each house contributed, each family adding something personal yet universal, a piece of their story, a symbol of their roots. We wanted to be seen not as rebellious children, but as a town that refused to let fear dictate life. The next morning, the street was transformed. Flags of every color, size, and shape waved proudly from porches, windows, and mailboxes. Handmade banners read, "We stand together, our pride, our home, not your pawn." Corinne's car stopped abruptly. She stepped out, arms rigid, her mouth opening and closing as if the words she wanted to say were trapped behind her teeth. Her plan of intimidation had collided headfirst with collective courage, and for the first time, she was unarmed in the battle she had started. I watched from my porch, heart hammering, as she strode toward one of the banners, clearly ready to tear it down to issue another threat. But the man standing beside it, Mr. Thompson, a retired veteran, didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just looked her in the eye, calm and steady, as if the years of service had tempered him for this very moment. "You'll have to do better than intimidation," he said, voice low but firm. Corinne froze, as if the words had caught her in a trap she hadn't seen coming. By noon, the street had become a battlefield of wills. Corinne was moving from house to house, issuing citations and complaints, but everywhere she went, the community held strong. Children waved flags from windows, elderly neighbors stood in their yards, arms crossed but resolute. The momentum had shifted. She had started this war alone, but now she was facing the collective weight of an entire town that refused to be silenced. And yet a tension lingered beneath the surface. We knew she wasn't done. Corinne's determination was relentless, and while the town had found strength in numbers, we were still vulnerable to one wrong move, one reckless escalation. I could feel it in the way the shadows lengthened across the street that evening, the way the wind whispered through the banners, almost as if warning us that the storm hadn't passed. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood in the middle of my yard, surveying the rows of flags waving proudly in the gentle breeze. I could hear distant murmurs from neighbors planning their next moves, quiet strategies whispered under the protection of twilight. And for the first time, I felt it, the raw, undeniable power of community. Corinne had wanted control. She had wanted fear. But she had forgotten the one thing that could never be legislated, never fined, never threatened: unity. And in that quiet twilight, I realized that whatever she attempted next, she would be facing more than one person. She would be facing a town awakened, proud, and unafraid. The question was no longer whether we could stand against her. The question was whether she would realize, before it was too late, that the battle she had started was already lost. Everyone knew something was coming. You could feel it in the air, like the quiet before a storm when even the birds hesitate to sing. The flags waved gently in the morning breeze, but underneath their fluttering fabric was a current of unease. Corinne had been escalating every day, and the town's patience was stretching thin, but none of us knew exactly what she would do next. It started with whispers at the HOA meeting. She had called an emergency session, citing gross violations of community standards. The hall was crowded, neighbors crammed shoulder to shoulder, hearts hammering, tension sharp as a knife. Corinne entered, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the room like a hawk. She smiled, but it was a predator's smile, one that promised consequences. "You all know why we're here," she began, voice dripping with authority. "Certain residents have been flagrantly violating HOA rules. This cannot continue. Immediate action must be taken, or the board will have no choice but to impose severe penalties." She paused, letting her words sink in, scanning the room again. She thought she had the upper hand. She thought fear would do what reason never could, bend us to her will. But instead of the quiet murmurs she expected, a wave of murmured dissent rose. People exchanged looks, subtle nods, and a quiet defiance spread like wildfire. Every person in that room had been touched by her cruelty, directly or indirectly. And for the first time, it felt like more than just one person versus Karen. It was a community versus tyranny. I stood up, my hands gripping the edge of the chair. My voice shook not with fear but with resolve. "This isn't about rules," I said. "This is about respect, about dignity, about living in a neighborhood where we can be proud of who we are without fear of retaliation." The room went quiet for a heartbeat, then a ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. Small nods, soft murmurs, hands raising slowly in solidarity. Karen's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward, her fingers gripping the podium. "You don't understand. These rules exist for a reason. Without them, there is chaos." "Chaos?" A voice interrupted from the back. Mr. Patel stood, calm but firm. "Is it chaos to let people display their pride, to honor their families, to live without intimidation?" The room shifted, every gaze turning toward him. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't threatening, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a thundercloud. Karen's jaw tightened, but she tried to maintain composure. "You will all be fined, citations will be issued, compliance is not optional." She glanced around as if daring someone to challenge her, and someone did. Slowly, deliberately, Mrs. Jensen, the oldest neighbor on the block, rose from her seat. "I've lived here 40 years, she said, voice steady but firm. "I've seen rules enforced fairly and I've seen them abused. This isn't fairness, this is cruelty, and we will not stand for it." Her words echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls like a call to arms. By the end of the meeting, the room was buzzing, not with fear but with determination. Karen had tried to intimidate, to assert control, but she had underestimated the power of people standing together. And outside, the town was beginning to show it. Banners went up in windows, posters appeared overnight, and even those who had been hesitant before started speaking out. But Karen was not done. That night she drove through the neighborhood, flashlight in hand, checking every flag, every sign, every subtle act of defiance. She wrote tickets, made phone calls, and left warnings on doors. Each act of intimidation was meant to instill fear, but each act only strengthened our resolve. Every neighbor who had felt alone realized they were not. Every person who had felt silenced realized they had a voice. By the following morning, the street had transformed into a display of quiet rebellion. Flags waved proudly from every porch, banners stretched across fences, and handmade signs carried messages that resonated beyond our community. "Pride, not fear. United we stand. This town belongs to all of us." Karen's threats felt small in comparison to the sheer volume of collective courage. But the tension was palpable. Karen was a storm, relentless and unpredictable, and somewhere in the shadows of her perfectly manicured lawn, she was plotting her next move. We didn't know what it would be, but we knew this. We could no longer hide behind quiet defiance. The next confrontation would be direct, unavoidable, and could change everything. That evening, I walked the street, taking in the scene. Neighbors were on porches, sharing stories, checking on each other, and offering quiet words of encouragement. The energy was electric, almost tangible. For the first time, I realized that what we were building wasn't just resistance. It was community. It was pride. It was the undeniable truth that together we were stronger than any one person's obsession with control. And as I paused to look at my own flag, still standing proud despite the shredding of earlier weeks, I felt a shift inside myself. This wasn't just about defending a piece of cloth. This was about defending what it meant to be human in the face of small tyrannies, about refusing to allow fear to dictate our lives. Karen had started this war thinking she was untouchable, but she had awakened something far greater than herself. And somewhere deep down, I knew that the next move, hers or ours, would decide not just the future of our street, but the future of every neighbor who had dared to rise. The morning started like any other, deceptively calm. The sun rose over our street, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the future, as if warning us that something was about to happen. And it did. Karen had decided to escalate in a way none of us expected. This time it wasn't just letters, citations, or whispers of fines. This time it was public. I was sipping coffee on my porch when I saw the first sign. Her truck, polished and intimidating, parked in the middle of the street. She stepped out with a clipboard, a glare that could cut steel, and she wasn't alone. A couple of HOA enforcers followed, their expressions professional but rigid, like soldiers sent to execute orders. The message was clear. She was coming for the flags. She was coming for us. Neighbors poured onto porches, stepped out of houses, and gathered in the yards. There was a quiet tension, an electric hum that ran through the street. Some faces were pale, some resolute, all aware that today was the tipping point. Karen, oblivious to the unity forming before her eyes, approached the first house. The message was clear. She was coming for the flags. She was coming for us. Neighbors poured onto porches, stepped out of houses, and gathered in the yards. Some faces were pale, some resolute, all aware that today was the tipping point. Her hand reached for the flagpole. The man standing there, Mr. Thompson, didn't move, not a flinch, not a step back. He just stared, calm but unwavering, as if decades of experience had prepared him for this exact moment. And then it began. The confrontation was subtle at first. Karen tried to assert her authority, rattling off regulations, waving fines, and speaking in clipped tones designed to intimidate. But each statement was met with a silent refusal, a quiet defiance. Mrs. Jensen leaned on her cane, watching with steely eyes. "You'll have to do better than threats," she said. Children peeked from windows, holding tiny flags, their eyes wide and determined. Karen's frustration was visible now. Her shoulders tensed, her hands clenched, and her words began to lose their sharpness. She realized, perhaps too late, that control was slipping through her fingers. Every attempt at intimidation collided with the invisible wall of community solidarity we had built over the past weeks. By mid-morning, the street had transformed into a scene of quiet rebellion. Flags waved from every home, banners stretched across fences, and handmade signs shouted in bold letters. "United we stand! This neighborhood belongs to all of us. Pride, not fear." Karen's enforcers hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Their orders were clear, but the human element, the unity of neighbors, was proving difficult to suppress. I watched from my porch, heart pounding. Every glance, every whispered word of encouragement, every supportive nod from a neighbor was a reminder that this fight was bigger than any one of us. It wasn't just my flag, or Mr. Patel's, or Mrs. Jensen's signs. It was the entire street standing together, refusing to let fear dictate our lives. And then it happened. Karen made her move. She lunged toward the largest banner, the one stretched across the Thompsons' fence, her hands gripping the edges with determination. But before she could tear it down, something unexpected occurred. The entire neighborhood almost instinctively stepped forward. Voices rose, not in anger, not in shouts, but in a unified chant. "This is our home, this is our home." The sound was deafening in its simplicity. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't chaos. It was pure, raw unity, and Karen froze. She blinked, glanced around, and for the first time, hesitation replaced arrogance. She had faced defiance before, but never like this. Never a wall of people, young and old, strong and weak, standing together with unwavering resolve. Her face twisted in frustration, and I could see the realization dawn. She couldn't control this street anymore. She couldn't intimidate us into silence. Every threat she had ever made, the fines, the letters, the citations, had lost their power because we refused to give them meaning. We had taken back our dignity. But the day wasn't over. Karen, relentless as ever, tried to regroup. She returned to her car, whispered into her phone, and a murmur of plans passed between her and her enforcers. We didn't know what she was plotting, but the tension hung like a storm cloud overhead. Something was coming, something calculated, something designed to hit the heart of our defiance. And yet, amid the uncertainty, there was pride, the kind that seeps into your bones and steadies your heart. I looked around at the neighbors, at faces I had known for years but truly saw for the first time in this moment. We weren't just standing against Karen. We were standing for each other, for the principles that make a neighborhood more than a collection of houses, for the shared humanity that refuses to bow to petty tyranny. By evening, the street was quiet again, the flags still waving, the banners still stretched proudly across fences. Karen had retreated for now, but the memory of today would linger. Not her authority, not her anger, but the realization that the people she had tried to suppress were stronger together than she could ever be alone. And as I stood on my porch, watching the sun set behind the waving flags, I understood something profound. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's standing firm when the world expects you to crumble. Sometimes it's holding onto pride, hope, and dignity, even when the storm seems inevitable. Karen had lit the fuse, but we were the fire. And from that fire, something remarkable was growing. Not just resistance, not just defiance. A community awakened, a town that refused to be bullied, and somewhere in the shadow of her retreat, I knew one thing for certain. The next move would come, and when it did, we would be ready. The tension in the air was electric the morning Karen returned. It wasn't subtle this time. Her car rolled down the street with precision, lights glaring, her face set in that unmistakable expression, the one that says she will not be denied. But this wasn't just a drive-by check anymore. This was escalation. The entire neighborhood could feel it. Hearts pounded in synchrony, a collective anticipation that something big was about to erupt. Karen stepped out, clipboard in hand, flanked by two enforcers. Her eyes scanned the street like a hawk searching for prey, but the prey had grown teeth. Every neighbor was outside now, quietly but firmly. Flags waved, banners stretched from fences, and handmade signs bore messages that could not be ignored. United we stand. We will not bow. This street belongs to us. Her first stop was the Thompsons' yard. Karen reached for the largest banner with force, determination in every movement, but the Thompsons didn't flinch. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his posture calm but unyielding. "This isn't yours to take," he said simply. His voice carried weight, the kind that comes from living a life where values matter more than fear. Karen's face twisted in frustration, her usual confidence faltering. Every attempt to intimidate, to assert dominance, met with silent resistance. The neighbor's presence had created a wall she could not penetrate. Even the enforcers hesitated, their orders colliding with the unspoken power of unity surrounding them. By mid-morning, the standoff had intensified. Karen moved down the street, checking each house, issuing threats, but nowhere could she find compliance. The neighborhood had shifted. What had started as individual acts of defiance had become a movement, a visible, undeniable collective resistance. And Karen realized, perhaps for the first time, that control was slipping through her fingers like sand. Then came the escalation. Karen, in a desperate bid to reclaim power, threatened to involve the city, to bring in legal measures, citations, even police intervention. She had calculated her moves carefully, thinking authority and fear could break the spirit of a few homeowners. But the spirit of the many could not be intimidated. The street erupted, not in anger, but in solidarity. Neighbors called out from porches, their voices rising together. "We are proud. We are united." Children waved flags, their laughter ringing louder than any threat. Even those who had previously stayed in the shadows stepped forward, adding their voices to the chorus of resistance. The energy was tangible, almost palpable, like a living force rising from the pavement itself. Karen's expression flickered between rage and disbelief. She had underestimated the simple power of people standing together. Every attempt at intimidation had the opposite effect, strengthening the bonds between neighbors. Even the quietest voices had been amplified by the sheer force of community solidarity. By afternoon, she tried her final tactic, tearing down the largest banner herself. But as she reached for it, something remarkable happened. Every neighbor stepped forward, forming a human wall of quiet defiance. Hands linked, eyes steady, they faced her not with hostility but with unwavering resolve. Karen froze, realizing she could not move forward without confronting the collective strength she had tried to suppress. And then the moral hit like a revelation. She had fought a war she could never win. Not because she lacked power on paper, but because she had ignored the most fundamental truth. Courage multiplied, resilience shared, pride defended collectively, cannot be crushed by rules or threats. I watched from my porch as the street transformed into a symbol of dignity. Flags waved with renewed strength, banners stretched taut against fences, and handmade signs proclaimed more than words. They proclaimed identity, pride, and unity. Karen's attempts to break us had done the exact opposite. They had made us unbreakable. The day ended with Karen retreating to her home, clipboard abandoned, plans thwarted. Her eyes, once sharp and predatory, now held a hint of defeat. For the first time, she had seen what she could not control. People who refused to bow, who refused to be intimidated, who stood together not for themselves alone, but for the very spirit of community. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of pride. This was not just about a flag. It was about something far greater, the understanding that dignity, courage, and unity could not be legislated away. That standing together, quietly, firmly, unapologetically, could create a force stronger than fear itself. Neighbors lingered on porches, sharing quiet smiles and nods, aware that something profound had occurred. We had faced intimidation, threats, and arrogance, and had emerged not just unscathed, but stronger. Karen had ignited a fire she could not control, and it had spread through every yard, every street corner, every heart in our neighborhood. I stood on my porch looking at the waving flags, the banners stretched proudly across fences, and I realized the truth. This wasn't the end. Karen might retreat, she might regroup, but the community had awakened. And once awakened, that spirit could never be dimmed. Sometimes the smallest acts, raising a flag, holding firm, speaking up, can ignite something extraordinary. Sometimes the quietest voices, when united, can create a roar that cannot be ignored. And in that twilight, with the neighborhood glowing in the fatting sun, I understood that we had not just defended a flag. We had defended pride, dignity, and the very essence of standing together. Karen had lost more than a battle. She had witnessed the undeniable power of a community that refused to be bullied. And in that lesson lay the quiet moral. Tyranny can threaten, rules can punish, and arrogance can attempt control. But unity, courage, and pride cannot be extinguished. The morning after the standoff felt almost surreal. The street was quiet, but it was a quiet charged with energy, the kind that hums through your bones and makes you feel alive in ways words can't capture. Flags still waved proudly, banners stretched taut across fences, and the subtle glances between neighbors carried more meaning than any conversation ever could. We had survived the storm, and in surviving we had discovered something extraordinary. Karen didn't appear at first. It was almost as if the air itself had swallowed her. But we all knew she was watching from her perfectly manicured home, peering over hedges, analyzing, calculating. The absence of her presence, though, spoke louder than any confrontation. She had been forced to retreat, and even from a distance we could feel the tension, the simmering frustration of someone who had underestimated the quiet power of collective courage. By mid-morning, neighbors emerged from their homes in small groups, exchanging smiles, shaking hands, sharing nods of solidarity. It was a new energy, one born not of rebellion but of pride. People laughed, they joked, they shared stories of past struggles and victories, realizing how much strength they had gained simply by standing together. It was like waking up after a long, dark night and discovering that the world had changed, just enough to remind you that hope is never lost. I walked down the street, stopping to talk to Mrs. Jensen, who had been a quiet force of strength throughout the conflict. Her eyes twinkled as she held my hand. "You see that?" she said softly. All of this, it's ours. We didn't just fight Karen, we fought fear itself." Her words lingered in the morning air, carrying weight beyond what she probably intended. It was true. Fear had been the weapon Karen wielded, and we had disarmed it simply by refusing to let it rule us. Even the children were different. They ran between yards, waving tiny flags, laughing with a new confidence. For them, the neighborhood had become a place where courage was visible, where standing for what you believed in mattered. And in their laughter, in the innocent pride they carried, I realized that this story wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone. Karen finally emerged in the late afternoon, her posture rigid, her face a mask of forced composure. She walked the street slowly, inspecting flags, banners, and signs, each one a reminder of the unity she could not break. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes, the subtle shift of someone realizing that their power had limits, that control is never absolute when people refuse to bow. She stopped in front of my house, her gaze lingering on the flag that had started it all. There was no sneer this time, no smug superiority, just silence. And in that silence, I understood something profound. She had witnessed the strength of unity firsthand, and for the first time it had humbled her. Pride can be taught, but humility must be learned, and this lesson was hers now. The rest of the afternoon passed in a calm but charged rhythm. Neighbors tended to gardens, washed cars, shared coffee on porches. But beneath the ordinary tasks, there was an undercurrent of celebration, quiet acknowledgement that we had survived a test far larger than any flag or sign. We had endured petty tyranny and emerged stronger, and that knowledge alone was intoxicating. By evening, a subtle ceremony emerged organically. Neighbors gathered in my backyard, not formally, not planned, but instinctively. Flags lined the yard, children ran between adults, and stories were shared, of small acts of courage, of moments when someone had refused to step back, when unity had felt heavier than fear. And in that circle, the moral became unmistakable. Courage isn't always loud, leadership isn't always visible, and strength is often measured by the quiet moments when you choose to stand, even alone, until you are not alone anymore. Karen remained inside her home that evening. I could see her from the corner of my eye, peering out through the curtains. And though I didn't know what she was thinking, I imagined the realization settling in slowly, uncomfortably, that the world doesn't bend to threats or arrogance. That control is only an illusion when faced with people who refuse to be intimidated. And yet the story didn't feel complete without reflection. I thought of my grandfather, the man who had taught me that pride isn't about bravado. It's about standing firm for what matters. He would have been proud not just of the flag, but of the unity, the courage, and the way our neighborhood had transformed from a quiet street into a community that refused to be bullied. By nightfall, the street had settled into a new rhythm. Lights glowed warmly in windows, laughter and conversation floated through open doors, and the flags waved gently in the breeze, resilient and unyielding. There was a sense of peace, not the absence of conflict, but the quiet confidence that we had faced it, and had not faltered. Karen had tried to assert power. She had tried to isolate, to intimidate, to control. And in the end, she had only revealed the opposite, The undeniable strength of people united, of pride defended collectively, of courage multiplied when shared. The flag, once torn and threatened, now stood as a symbol, not of defiance for defiance's sake, but of resilience, dignity, and the human spirit's refusal to be diminished. I stood on my porch that night, looking at the street bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, feeling the quiet joy and pride that comes from hard-won victory. And I knew this. Whatever Karen did next, whatever rules she tried to enforce, whatever threats she attempted, the community had changed. We had changed, and no one, not a single person, could ever take that away. Sometimes the smallest acts, raising a flag, refusing to bow, standing firm, can create ripples that change everything. And in that moment, with neighbors smiling and children laughing, I realized that our story, our battle, had become something larger than any one of us. It was a story of hope, courage, and the undeniable power of unity. Karen had tried to control us, but in the end, she had awakened something she could never understand, never contain, and never destroy. And that was the most important victory of all. The morning was calm, almost serene, but there was a quiet electricity in the air. The street had changed, not just the houses or the flags, but the people. Every porch, every yard, every window carried a newfound confidence, a sense of pride that had nothing to do with rules or regulations and everything to do with unity. The battle with Karen had ended, but the lessons, the strength, and the spirit remained. I stepped onto my porch, taking in the sight. Flags waved proudly, banners stretched across fences, and neighbors were moving about, exchanging smiles, nods, and quiet words of encouragement. The tension that had gripped our street for weeks had lifted, replaced with something far more enduring: solidarity. Each face told a story of courage, resilience, and the knowledge that together we were unbreakable. Karen was inside her house, visible through the curtains, silent and still. I imagined the thoughts running through her mind. Perhaps for the first time, she realized that her tactics, threats, intimidation, and control had failed not because we were reckless, but because we were united. Her presence, once commanding, now seemed diminished, almost fragile in the face of a community that refused to bow. Neighbors began to gather in the street, not because of conflict, but in celebration of what we had accomplished together. Children ran with small flags in hand, their laughter echoing across the yards, a reminder of the joy and innocence that had persisted despite the storm. Adults exchanged quiet stories, laughter, and gratitude, realizing that the true victory lay not in defying Karen alone, but in discovering the hidden strength within themselves and one another. It was in that moment that I understood something profoundly simple yet powerful. Courage, once shared, is unstoppable. Pride, once nurtured collectively, becomes a force that cannot be legislated away. And community, once awakened, cannot be silenced by fear or petty rules. We had started with a single flag, a symbol of memory and dignity, and had ended with an entire street standing together, stronger than any authority could ever hope to be. I walked slowly down the street, stopping at each house, exchanging nods, smiles, and quiet congratulations. Every person I passed had contributed to this transformation, not through confrontation or conflict, but through steadfast refusal to allow fear to dictate their lives. The unity we had forged was a living, breathing testament to the human spirit, resilient and unyielding. Karen never stepped outside that day, but in her absence the street thrived. Flags waved higher, banners were refreshed, and a sense of permanence settled over the neighborhood. The town had learned a lesson she could never teach: that power derived from fear is fragile, and that respect, pride, and dignity cannot be imposed. They must be earned and defended collectively. By afternoon, the community had organized a small, informal gathering in my backyard. Neighbors shared stories of small victories, of moments when they almost faltered but chose to stand, and of the exhilaration that comes from facing intimidation with unity. Children displayed artwork inspired by our struggle, small flags painted with bold colors, each stroke a reminder of courage passed to the next generation. I looked around at the faces of those who had once felt powerless, who had lived under the shadow of Karen's control, and I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. We had defended more than a flag. We had defended pride, dignity, hope, and the fundamental right to exist without fear of petty tyranny. Every smile, every laugh, every nod was proof that we had succeeded not just in defiance, but in transformation. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, I stood on my porch once more, reflecting on everything that had happened. Karen's reign of intimidation had ended, not with conflict or aggression, but with courage, unity, and steadfast pride. The lesson was clear. Tyranny can threaten, rules can punish, and arrogance can attempt control. But collective resilience, courage, and the refusal to be silenced are unstoppable. Neighbors lingered outside, talking, laughing, and celebrating the victory that belonged to all of us. Children ran through the yards, waving small flags, their voices carrying across the street like a promise for the future. And in that shared joy, the true meaning of our struggle revealed itself. Courage is contagious, pride is powerful, and community is enduring. Karen never fully understood what had happened. She had tried to control, intimidate, and diminish, but in the process, she had inadvertently strengthened the very thing she sought to suppress. And that, I realized, was the quiet beauty of our story. Victory wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, and it wasn't about revenge. It was about standing together, refusing to be silenced, and discovering the extraordinary power that lives in the hearts of ordinary people. That night, I returned to my porch, watching the flags ripple in the gentle breeze. The street was alive with warmth, laughter, and light. Our neighborhood had endured fear, intimidation, and petty tyranny, and had emerged stronger, braver, and more united than ever. The flag that had once been torn now stood tall, not just as a symbol of memory, but as a beacon of pride, courage, and collective dignity. In the end, the story wasn't about Karen. It was about all of us, neighbors who chose courage over fear, unity over isolation, and pride over submission. And as the stars began to shimmer above our street, I realized that the true victory was far greater than any confrontation. It was the awakening of a community that refused to be bullied, a town that stood together, and the knowledge that ordinary people, when united, can accomplish extraordinary things. Because in the quiet strength of unity, the smallest acts can become the most powerful, the meek can become resolute, and a single flag can ignite an entire town. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.